My grandmother always told me that if you want to stop crying, you should count something. Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. As promised in my last video, I'm here today to talk to you about the book Lancelot by Giles Kristian. This is an Arthurian fantasy novel that I read for my Arthurian fantasy subgenre challenge last month. So I'm going to tell you about the book and tell you how this Arthurian fantasy has come out of nowhere, stolen my heart, and stolen the top spot on my favorite books of all time list. I will do everything that I can to avoid spoilers in this video, but if you're unfamiliar with Arthurian legend, King Arthur, King Arthur's court, Excalibur, the Sword and the Stone, all of those things, then I can't avoid spoilers because that's what this book is about, and this book assumes that you have some understanding of that legend. Also, though, this author does deviate from the more widely accepted versions of that legend, the versions that we've been told before in books and in film. So I will do my best to avoid those differences because I think that those differences and those choices do turn out to be spoilers for those who are familiar with the legend. So it's a complicated book to talk about, but I'm going to do my absolute best because I really want to draw attention to it. I really want to convince as many people as possible to read it and hopefully love it as much as I do. Obviously, the story is about Lancelot. Lancelot is one of the most famous characters in the King Arthur legend. He was both a skilled and capable knight sitting on King Arthur's court, as well as one of King Arthur's most trusted confidants. Unfortunately, the thing that makes Lancelot most famous to a lot of us are the inappropriate feelings that he developed for King Arthur's wife, Guinevere. There are different variations to the accounts of how involved Lancelot and Guinevere became with each other while King Arthur was alive. But back in 5th century Britain, when all of this allegedly took place, even the slightest amount of affection or adoration between Lancelot and Guinevere would have been seen as a huge betrayal. So I was drawn to this book to satisfy my Arthurian legend reading challenge for the month because I am a romance reader and Lancelot is very famous for the undeniable feelings he had for another man's wife and all of the scandal and drama and controversy of that story. It's just something that I would eat up. And so I was very attracted to this. However, this book is not primarily about the controversy of Guinevere and Lancelot's relationship in adult life or King Arthur finding out about it. Yes, that is featured in this novel. However, the majority, the meat of this story is about Lancelot coming of age, about his feelings developing for Guinevere, and about the place of importance that Guinevere began to occupy in Lancelot's heart and mind. It's a doozy. It's gut-wrenching. It's heartbreaking. It's devastating. I'm 5 days out from reading this book or from finishing this book, and I just now feel okay. And that's why, much to my own surprise and others as well, apparently, this has become my favorite book because it was simply one of my favorite reading experiences. I was grieving after I finished this book. I talk about a book hangover. I don't think that sums it up efficiently. Like, I expressed to people that I was almost in mourning because while this book was so tragic, I still wasn't done feeling that tragedy. I still wanted more, and I just, talk about weird. Very weird. But I'm okay now, I think, though 1 or 2 crying breaks may need to occur throughout the course of this video. We'll just have to wait and see. So I mentioned that the bulk of the book being about Lancelot coming of age, and that is true. The book begins when Lancelot is 8 years old. He is actually the second-born son of a king who ruled over a portion of what we now know as France. The book opens on the night when Lancelot's father's land is raided by another king and his warriors. The family and some of the other occupants of this land have to flee to save their lives, and they have to leave people behind. And immediately it just paints this picture of a boy caught up in really complicated adult circumstances. We get glimpses of Lancelot in these first few pages of how endearing he is and how smart he is and how observant he is. And I think any reader would immediately begin to care for Lancelot in a way that it would take chapters to begin to care for other characters. I mean, Giles Kristian just immediately says, here is this sweet, innocent boy who's about to lose everything. He's in your care now. And you're just like, oh my gosh, okay. But they flee to the coast and take shelter with another king on his land, just long enough for everybody to become comfortable in this new place. They are betrayed by somebody very close to them, and most of them are killed. Lancelot happens to escape, and he is taken to this small island off the coast of Britain where he grows up. This island is host to a lot of young men and young women sent either to learn how to be warriors, learn the trade of war, or to learn how to be healers and good wives eventually. This book takes a bit of a departure by introducing Guinevere to Lancelot when he is 10 and she is 11. She arrives on the island, and their formative adolescent years are spent together, and that is how the friendship and the feelings initially develop. The story of Lancelot is so tragic, and okay, bye-bye now. Have a good day. The story of Lancelot is so tragic that even while he's physically safe, he continues to be dealt blow after blow and lose things that are important to him and experience tragedy. And as the reader who has already begun to care for him, we experience those things as well. I cried probably at least 6 times throughout the course of this book. The first time being within the first 100 pages, the last time being on the very last page. It was gut-wrenching throughout. And one may say, well, that sounds awful. That sounds like a horrible experience. But if you're like me and you read to be emotionally moved by things, and that is the most important thing to you when you read, then a book like Lancelot is a dream come true. A book like Lancelot just, I can't remember ever being carried off to another place, and in this case, another century, another time, and cheering for somebody so hard and mourning for someone's losses so hard as I did in this book. And I've never, ever had another reading experience like that, ever. Even the books that have, made me super happy, or the other books that have made me cry, have never accomplished what this book did, which is total transportation of my mind for the duration of the novel. Like, I would sit down to read this book and immediately be swept away in it. And it's not just because it's sad. It's not just because of this great love story embedded within it, but also, I mean, Lancelot becomes a warrior. There are scenes of war. There are battles. There are gory death scenes, and all of it was just so enthralling. You feel all of it. The writing was so beautiful. It's so accessible, which I appreciate, considering this is content that is from so long ago. These characters supposedly lived so long ago that a lot of Arthurian fantasy novels, or fantasy novels in general, get too inaccessible to me via the language that the author chooses to use, the way in which they choose to write. Giles Kristian's writing in Lancelot is very accessible. I remember reading it and being shocked that I was like poring over every word. I don't know if I've ever flat out admitted this to you guys, but like when I read with my eyes, a physical book with my eyes, I read every piece of dialogue for sure. And then I make sure that I get the point of paragraphs. Especially when it comes to description. As long as I know, okay, I get it. Like, I'm not usually one who gets caught up in writing. And so I'm always really appreciative of an author who can glue my eyes to every single word. I didn't skim this book. I didn't hop over things. This book being great is very personal to me and very personal to my reading experience. Granted, it has a 4.25 rating on Goodreads. Other people find it great as well. Critics find it great as well. But the reason I think it's a favorite of mine now is because of my experience reading it, because it did to me what no other book has ever done, and I'm in awe of that. And it's not perfect, and I don't want anybody to pick this up thinking it is the most well-written fantasy about the legends of King Arthur. That's not the case. Like I said, there will be people who don't appreciate it because it does veer away from the other tales we've been told of King Arthur and King Arthur's court. It also has a bit of a pacing issue. The middle of the book gets kind of slow. I don't want to say boring, because this book is actually never boring. But if you're reading it because of Lancelot and Guinevere, there's going to be a whole portion in the middle of the book where Guinevere is not even on the radar. If you're reading it for the battle scenes and to read about the warrior that Lancelot was, there's going to be a big portion of this book at the beginning that is not Lancelot fighting and winning and experiencing a lot of triumph. So I don't think every single reader will be enthralled with every single page of this book, but I do think that there's something in this book for every different kind of reader. It's hard for me to say that this is a great Arthurian fantasy because I don't read Arthurian fantasy. I don't know that for sure. I can't make that claim. But another reason that I think this is a really good book is because it succeeds at something for me where other fantasy novels fail. And that's that fantasy novels usually have an immense number of characters, an immense number of places, and I'm not going to lie, I sometimes have trouble keeping track of all that stuff. I sometimes have trouble remembering who the person behind that character name is. And Lancelot has a lot of characters, and the book follows the entire lifetime of one man who travels everywhere. And I never got confused. I never thought, wait, who was that again? The author mentioned a name. I immediately knew who they were. And that's, to me, an indication of really good story development and really good character development. Either the author told me enough or engaged a character enough in an event that I remembered that character, or the author made the character memorable enough that if they weren't mentioned for another 100 pages, they were still easily remembered when the time came to read about them again. And that to me just signifies talent on the part of the author, especially for a book like this, a fantasy novel like this. I'm just going off the experiences that I've had with other novels of its kind in the past. There haven't been a lot. I love this book in almost an illogical way. I can't list all of these technical merits that it has. To be honest with you, I don't know. I don't remember, because the experience of it was so engrossing that I can say that nothing Giles Kristian did took me out of the story. The middle was a little bit slow for me, but other than that, his writing never distracted me from feeling everything that these characters felt. That's all I need in terms of technical skill. Is don't do anything in a book that yanks me out of the story and makes me notice your improper word usage or your bad grammar or your, plot holes or what have you. I could gush about this book all day, but I would really just be saying the same things over and over and over again, which is how sad it is, and yet how wonderful it was to be that sad for 630 pages. I don't know, but I know this. I know that as the reader, I became really attached to Lancelot. I loved him as a child. I rooted for him when he faced all of his challenges. I was defending him when the major conflict with Arthur rose. Like, I was just on Lancelot's side from page 1 to page 630 something. And even the end, when I was so angry with him, I still loved him more than any character in literature that I've ever encountered, ever. It's not like Lancelot was a favorite before this book. I never sought out stories about Lancelot, and now I'm like, I feel like he was my child and my best friend and the love of my life and my father, and I've just never had that level of attachment to a character before. Liked? Sure. Enjoyed? Yeah. That was funny? Of course. But in this book, Lancelot is a character that endures so much self-sacrifice for duty and for honor and for the benefit of others that, I don't know, Giles Kristian just set the reader up prepared to make sacrifices for the character. Like, it's just crazy to me. So good. It is so good. And Lancelot does lose a lot. And I think that if we want to get into like the psychology behind what's so devastating and tragic about the book and his story in particular, Lancelot loses a lot and never gives up. He never becomes entitled. He never plays a victim. He just experiences loss after loss. And I think that in some ways, the Lancelot of this book sees Guinevere as the compensation for all of that tragedy. That here is this, in his mind, perfect girl that he loves and that loves him. And she just represents the good that is finally supposed to happen to him. And he doesn't get her either. And you're just like, Jesus. I'm already emotional. And this next part is a real tearjerker. So there's an afterword by the author once the actual story is finished. That's where he acknowledges taking some liberties with the legend and kind of veering off from traditional retellings. But he also explains to the reader how a lot of this book was written while he was grieving and mourning the loss of his father. I read that. I took that in. I empathized and, thought about the ways in which the sadness I felt while reading could have mirrored the grief that he was feeling while writing. And I thought about it, but it didn't dawn on me till much later that what I think the author has actually done is crafted the character of Lancelot we can feel so strongly for, because that is the way the author felt about his father. Like, I feel like Lancelot became the embodiment of the author's perception of his own father, that hero. And that might be me reaching, and that might be me making assumptions and abandoning objectivity for the purpose of this review. Lancelot just embodies a lot of the characteristics that exist in our heroes that we choose to worship. I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of this book. I hope I'm a huge fan of its follow-up called Camelot, which is about Lancelot's son, Galahad. I certainly didn't know an Arthurian fantasy like this existed. A in-depth and intimate look at one character's journey through the legend, written in first person. And I wouldn't at all say that this is only written for fantasy readers or Arthurian fantasy readers. I would encourage anybody who thinks it sounds interesting to read it. I mean, if you're watching this, chances are you know the role that mystery and thriller and horror and romance play in my reading life. And if I can walk away from a book like Lancelot thinking that it's my favorite book of all time, then there's hope for everyone else too. I am probably doing a huge disservice to this book. I am probably hyping it up to a point that no one listening to me will ever like the book half as much as I'm telling you you will like the book. So I'm going to probably stop now before I do more harm than good. But my point is, nobody is more shocked than me that this fantasy novel came out of nowhere and became my favorite. And if it could happen to me, it could happen to you. If my thriller-loving heart could read an Arthurian fantasy and fall in love with it, then your thriller-loving heart could as well. So just consider it. Keep it in mind. There's not enough people talking about it on BookTube. I've done a search for people talking about it on BookTube. There's not enough people talking about it. This author does have a lot of other historical fantasy series about I think there's a series about Vikings. He's written a lot about these far-off worlds and has been admired for those other works as well. I think that there's something here. I think I have something here. I do. I think that I do. I think my instincts about this one are good. And unfortunately, you're probably going to hear about this book over and over and over and over and over again. But on the upside, maybe for a little while, you'll stop hearing about The One and The Whisper Man and Lost You and all of those other books that I talk about over and over and over again. I finally have something different to talk about, guys. And that's a great thing. That's great. So this over here, over my shoulder, that's the hardcover of Camelot, the second book. It arrived. I'll haul it for you guys, of course, when the time comes. But I'm really excited to read it. Let me know if you have any questions about Lancelot, or if you need any more convincing to go out there and read it. I'll do it. I'll convince you. If you have read it, if you are a subscriber of mine, or if you've wandered to my channel seeking out content about Lancelot, let's talk about it. Let's have a discussion about it. I'm curious how other readers received this book. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all very soon.